Hello, in this video we're going to talk about a new feature that's come to Azure Logic App Standard, which is in private preview, and that is .NET Framework Custom Code Extensibility. So in this video we're going to discuss how you can use the upcoming Custom Code Extensibility feature that is found in Azure Logic App Standard. As I just mentioned, this feature is in private preview, and we do have some plans for additional experience investments, but naturally we're interested in feedback. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a sample in this video of how you can get started. Now, the current scope that we are supporting is a code action that's available inside the Logic Apps Designer, inside of Visual Studio Code. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to use this code action to call an Azure function template with specific Logic App workflow action trigger. And so this is going to allow us to call that custom code, but we're really leveraging the Azure function code projects, code templates in order to make this work. Now, we will support local debugging, so that's both from a code view in your function itself, plus the workflow. And before we get deeper into this, just want to shout out to some of my colleagues, Swetcha, Rohitha, and Lavish from the engineering group for their efforts in building this capability, and then also helping assemble the content that's being presented here as well. Now, a couple things to call out from a prerequisites perspective. So, number one, you're going to need a working instance of Logic App Standard for VS Code. So we do have this set of prerequisites here, and this is essentially a starting point. I would start before even, if you're new to this, if this is the first time you're setting up VS Code, make sure you can run a Logic app before even trying to include calling custom code, because if you can't just have a regular Logic app working in VS Code, the additional capabilities aren't going to work either naturally. Beyond that, we do need .NET Core Runtime and .NET Framework SDK 4.7.2 for this to work as well. Now, in terms of being able to call out to .NET, that is the highest version that we do support is 4.7.2 itself. So just be aware of that. Now, the other thing is, even if you manage to get your hands on this video and the sample project itself, there is a feature flag that needs to be enabled in order to make this work. For some reason, if you don't have this feature flag, do let me know and I will be able to get it to you. I'll include the link for these prerequisites in the description of this video if you're interested. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a sample. So this is something that Swetcha, one of my colleagues, has put together. This is on her GitHub repo. You can go ahead and download the entire GitHub repo. You open it with GitHub Desktop or download with the zip. And what you're going to be interested in is this particular folder here called Logic Apps Custom Code Sample. That is what I'm going to be running you through here in this video. Here is a link to Swetcha's repo where you can go ahead and access this sample. So let's jump in and get into the demo. All right, so here I'm in Swetcha's repo. You can see that here. Basically, it's a fork of the Logic Apps repo where she's added this code sample. I just went ahead and downloaded a zip, and I've got that in a folder here, just locally on my hard drive. I'm going to just go ahead and unzip this folder. Okay, that is unzipped. You can now just jump into this folder and we will find the folder that we're interested in called Logic Apps Custom Code Sample. So just go ahead and find that. Now inside of this folder, you're going to see a workspace file. And then what you're going to see is two projects. We've got a workflow project called Logic App, and then our functions project called Functions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just copy as path for this workspace file. Then I'm going to go into VS Code, click on Open Workspace from File, and then be able to paste that in. All right, so let's just take a brief tour, see what we have inside of this workspace. So as I mentioned, we have two projects, right? We've got our functions project, and we've got our logic apps project, and then we've got our workspace file. Now, there are some important things within each of these projects that is required for this to all work. So for each project, do make sure you've got a .vs Code folder that is included. Now, as part of that, we need to ensure we've got these four files: extensions.json, launch.json, which is going to be quite important when we start to talk about debugging. And here you can see that we are attaching to .NET functions, and the type is CLR, basically the common language runtime. This is .NET Framework, so this is quite important. Our process name is going to be our .NET Framework worker itself. So once again, should all be there, but I think especially as you say take the sample and you adopt it to say maybe build something yourself, that's why I'm going through all of this, is to make sure you've got this in place. Settings, nothing, this is all kind of default type stuff here. And then our tasks. So we naturally have a build task, and that's going to be quite important, as you're going to see shortly, as we go ahead and build these assemblies and then bin place them into the correct location. Now, we do have this bin debug net472 folder. After we go ahead and compile this is going to be more interesting for you, but this is naturally where our files are going to be locally compiled to. We've got our functions.cs project as well. What's important here is that we've got this XML tag called logic app folder, where we need in order to bin place the assemblies as they're compiled. So in our project here, we have it called logic app. So if you create your own sample, your own instance, make sure that you update this folder to reflect the name of your logic app project. Now, this is another thing that needs to be there. It's essentially our package reference for our workflow action trigger. This is what's going to make our .NET assembly callable from logic apps. So once again, important to have that there, otherwise this will not work. You can also see that we've got some other build tasks that are going on here in terms of bin placement and where we need to deposit our compiled assemblies and their related dependencies and move them. So once again, this is quite important. Now, if we go into our invoked function.cs, this is our function. Now, what's important here is we've got some references. These will get resolved as soon as I build this, but we also have this function name called flow invoked function. This is the name of the value that we're going to include in our code action in the Logic Apps workflow project, and this needs to match. We also have this workflow action trigger declaration, as I've talked about before. This is what's going to allow our Logic App project to call this specific method. Now here you can kind of think of this as a little bit of a hello world type scenario, where we're going to receive a couple strings coming in. We're going to then create a dictionary, and then we're just going to go ahead and send a result back. So this is where you'd go ahead, implement any of your business logic, and yeah, that's kind of where you would go ahead and do so. Lastly, then the NuGet.config here, this is just where we're currently storing the workflow action trigger in MyGet. Obviously, as we move this to public preview and beyond, this would be in the regular NuGet repositories. So that's functions and that project. Now let's take a look at Logic App. Once again, VS Code, we're going to have these 4 files here. The launch.json is important when we get into debugging. Here we're going to launch to our Logic App, where our type is going to be core CLR. So this is where one of the differences. This isn't .NET Framework like our function code was. Our settings, the project runtime is 4. And then we've got some tasks as well that we want to include. So just make sure that you've got these files set up as well. Here's our workflow. We can go ahead and just open this up in the designer. So that will take a few moments to go ahead and load, but when it's loaded, we're going to see request trigger, HTTP request. We're then going to have our code action invoke a function in this logic app, and then a response. You should see this icon. If you don't see this, that means that something's not right within your configuration. Where we can go ahead and find this action is just go into built-in, then do a search for invoke, and you'll find the local function operation here. So that's where you go ahead and find it. Now if we take a look at the configuration, we've got that function name, right? So flow invoked function. That is what I referred to before, where you need to make sure that the function name matches up with what we have in our code action. So for now, this is a text box. You do have to manually type it. We are definitely looking into how we can create a dynamic experience here and be able to enumerate what exists and load that up. Here is our two parameters, right? We're passing in a JSON object, and we will go ahead and pass those in. And this would be another sort of future opportunity as well for us, is being able to have some dynamic content here and have a little bit more of a friendlier experience. But for now, this is how you go ahead and do it. If we think about our response, we do have access to the body. Because it's going to come back as JSON, you could go ahead and introduce a parse JSON action there and do some additional formatting and parsing as you see fit. This would be sort of another opportunity we'd love to get some feedback on. Okay, in terms of what else is interesting here, host.json, we do have our feature flag, so I've blurred this out on purpose, but the feature flag would show up here in workflow settings. And yeah, that's kind of the extent of the walkthrough. Now, in order to get this thing working, the first thing we need to do is make sure Azurite is running. So let's go in to Azurite. Let's click on View, Command Palette, Azurite Start. Now, because we've got a workspace and two folders, two projects, we're going to ask which directory we want to use. For this, we're going to use the Logic Apps project. Now, what you are going to find is that you're going to have to hit Azurite 3 times, once per service. So we've got table, queue, and blob. And so we're going to get prompted for each one of these projects. So that's just something to be aware of. So this is the 3rd time, Azurite start, and we should see that all of our services are running locally. And once that takes place, then we're good to go. Okay, so those 3 are now running. We're good. So we need to build first. We need to build our function project. So let's go into terminal, and we'll just click on new terminal. We can ask what folder. In this case, we can go ahead and select functions because that's where we're going to do our compilation. Here we can just go ahead and issue a .NET build. And when we go ahead and complete that build, we should see that our assemblies are now generated. And so the build succeeded. If we take a look at our folder here, we've got bin, we've got all of the various assemblies, including functions.dll, which is the one that we just created. We also have this folder that includes our function.json, which is kind of like a manifest file for our assembly. So do ensure that you've got those. Now, if we now look into our Logic App project, this is where we need to make sure these same files exist. And that's where that build task will take care of it for us. And we've got our function.json, and then we've got our net472 and our related assembly and its dependencies available for us. So that is quite important from that perspective. That's kind of a prerequisite here. Now we can go ahead, and I'm just going to close out of this terminal. And we can now go ahead and try to run this without debugging initially. What you can do is go ahead and click on Run Without Debugging. you're going to get a prompt. Let me show you this. No process with a specified name is currently running. The reason for this is you want to then make sure you switch from the functions project into the logic apps project. And once you do that, then you'd be able to go ahead and run without debugging. So that's exactly what's happening here. And so that's where you can find this in the bottom left-hand corner of your designer here. This will take a few moments to spin up. I'll show you in a second here how you know when it's working. Okay, so this is kind of the key. When you see this, you know you're in good shape. And what it is, it's you see the functions and you see invoke function workflow. So that's our workflow. Then we've got our function, that flow invoked function workflow action trigger. If you don't see this, there's something going on configuration wise, because you do need to have this basically running. And then we've got the workflow dispatcher as well. So at this point, we're in pretty good shape. And now how we can kick this off is go and find our workflow. Right mouse click on overview. And when you see this run trigger and you see this URL, you know you're in good shape. And so we could go into Postman and go ahead and call this, but since we're not passing in a payload, we can just go ahead and click on run trigger. And when we go ahead and do so, our workflow will now execute, and we should see a record show up here indicating when it's completed. And there we see we've got the record itself. And if we click into it, we should see our run history. So that's great. That's that scenario. Let's just shut down the terminal here. And let's now get into more of the interactive debugging session that we want to go through. So let's go into our workflow.json. Here we can go ahead and specify a breakpoint. And in this case, it's right before we go ahead and call our function. If we go into our function, we can once again set a breakpoint here as well. Now, to go ahead and kick this off, we can click on basically either at the bottom here attached to logic apps, or we can click on the run and debug console. And then when we do so, we want to ensure that we've got attached to logic app, and then click the play button. And then just give this a few moments to fire up. Once we see like the terminal loading here in like the bottom part of our screen, and we see that the function's been loaded, the workflow's been loaded, etc. At that point, we can then go ahead and also start the debugger for our function as well. Okay, so we see that this is now loaded. It will take a little bit of time. I did pause the recording. But once you're at this point, you know you're good. Head back up here, then select Attach to .NET Functions. Go ahead and click that play button. And then you should see this bar turn orange, and you should see this Attach to .NET Functions showing up here as well. Let's head over to Overview, and let's go ahead and run the trigger again. And then just give this a moment, and we should see that our breakpoints are hit, right? So now we're in the workflow, and as a result, we've hit the breakpoint. You can go ahead and hit F5 or come up to run and then hit continue. And now we should jump over into our code. So here's our function. You know, if we go ahead and highlight parameters, we can see what our inputs are. And once again, we can go ahead and step into this, step over, etc. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and hit continue, hit F5. But that's kind of the typical experience that you would see with your VS Code experience. If we head back over to Overview, we see our new record. Once again, we can go ahead and click into it. So that is that. So let's go ahead, let's just stop this. Now, one question you might have is, okay, what's happened once I've gone ahead and, you know, I'm done testing with this? What can I do with it? You can go ahead and deploy this into Azure. If you go ahead and head over to your Logic App project and then your workflow itself, you can go ahead and deploy to Logic App. The assemblies will come with it, and you will be able to go ahead and run and edit this inside of Azure. Now, inside of Azure, so this is the Logic App that I've deployed to Azure. a couple things you got to be aware of. One is assemblies, right? So this is something that's relatively new, and when you click on assemblies, you should go ahead and see the various assemblies that we saw in VS Code. This is our core assembly, and then we've got the related dependencies. So that's where you're going to find those assemblies. If we go to our app settings, there's going to be a couple things that you do need to ensure exist. Number one is the feature flag. So Azure Web Jobs feature flags enable multi-language worker. We definitely need that. And then we also have this functions worker runtime, and that should be set to .NET-isolated. So that would be, those are two settings that you need to ensure exist. Now, one other thing that we do need to just validate is if we go into Kudo by clicking on Advanced Tools and then Go, we just want to go ahead and tweak that function.json file as well. So inside of Kudo, go to Debug Console, click on CMD, go to Site, www.root, lib, custom, flow invoked function, function.json. Then just to ensure that the script file is pointed at net472 functions.dll. And so if we think about this, let's cancel out of here. So this is up one folder in the net472 folder, then functions.dll. So up one folder, net472 functions.dll. Just make sure that is updated, because I think before that we'll say bin instead. So just make sure that's set up properly. Then if we go over to our workflow, what we'll see is a similar experience that you saw in the VS Code Designer, right? Invoke a function in this logic app. Here, once again, you can provide the function name and the various parameters. Now, obviously you're not editing code up in Portal, so you probably just want to be doing some tweaks, but definitely do your development in VS Code, do your debugging locally, and then naturally you can go ahead and deploy this and then run it in Azure if that's of interest to you. So hopefully that helps as well, just giving you a bit of a tour there. So thanks for checking out this feature. If you have any feedback, please be in touch. Remember, this is private preview. This is not the end of the line. This is the first step of the process, and we're definitely interested in hearing about your different scenarios and uses for this capability. Thanks again for checking this out.